Chapter 5 The Corsairs. For a moment, he believed he was back in the throes of his fever, and that this was just another trick it played on his senses. Then his numbed feet protested. It was no dream, though he might as well have wakened out of one. He stepped gratefully out of the icy rivulet he had landed in, and sat down on the bank to wring out his boots and stuff them with what dry grass he could find. They were stout ones a trader had given him, and he was glad he had been wearing them, and his cloak, when he went to the door. He was tired and cold, and hunger grew on him as he sat, a ravening hunger. He had hardly anything with him, less even than he had had when he came to the salt marshes. He was without even his valued bird bow and fishing lines. A thought struck him, and he fumbled at his belt. The sword was not there, and he panicked for a moment before he noticed it lying on the bank a little further upstream, presumably where he had first halted. That was something, anyway, the minimum to keep him warm and protect him. As he stooped to pick it up, he saw beside it a single, wide hoofprint in the mud, with water still oozing into it. He sprang up and stared around, but nowhere on earth or sky was there a rider to be seen. The blood roared and rumbled in his ears. "You bastard bitch's son," he muttered, gripping the hilt tightly. "What have you done to me? Where have you taken me? How?" But he left it at that. He did not dare voice the question of how he was going to get back. It might have no answer. First things first. He had to look around, find at least some indication of where he was. By the stars, but there would be none visible tonight, nor moon either. Somewhere behind those clouds the sun was setting. He could make a rough guess where, and marked the direction as he tramped back to his boots. They were nothing like dry, but he could not afford to be fussy. He hauled the grass out and cursed when it came out covered in fine sand. Sand? He peered at the rivulet, dug his fingers into the bed. The soft, heavy stuff poured through his fingers, and a salty, seaweedy smell rose to his nostrils. He looked up and down the winding bank. The grass here was much taller, head-high in many places, and with broader leaves. In between the tall stems grew spear scales, saltworts, beach burr, bright sand verbena, all plants he remembered from his childhood, but had never seen by the causeway. He swallowed, stood up, sniffed the air again, and listened. The smell was strong in the air, far stronger than the slight tang he was used to. That rumbling sound, it had not been his blood, not entirely. Somewhere not far from here, more or less in the direction the sun had gone, surf was beating upon a beach. He swallowed again, with difficulty, for his throat was very dry. Once, when they had been talking about the Eqwesh beginning to raid inland, he had asked Cathel and his partners if the causeway was safe at such a lonely point, and Cathel had replied with a laugh, "Surely enough. The marshes are really a river delta. They spread wider as they near the sea. So naturally they built the causeway high up the delta, inland, to keep it short." "So you know how far your smithy is from the sea?" "Nigh on 70 leagues. That make you feel fine and safe?" Once it had. Once. Now it crushed him. He knew now where the smithy was. He could walk there simply by keeping the sunrise ahead of him, sunset behind. But 70 leagues? When 2 or 3 was a good day's walking over marshy ground? He sat in silence and listened to the surf, and despaired. But as his hearing became more used to the rumbling sound, he began to hear other noises through it. Some high-pitched sounds that might be the voices of birds, or seals, or men. He delayed only a moment before getting up and cautiously wading out through the mist that was rising and flowing like the ghost of a flood. Men meant fire and food and company, a chance to survive in this dreadful place. They might be hostile, of course, but he had his sword. It was a shorter walk than he expected before he found the flatness of the ground changing to grassy dunes, through which the rivulets cut as their greater selves cut mountains. Through one of these deep clefts, he heard the voices more clearly. The mist hung thickly now, but as he peered cautiously round the end of the dune onto the open beach, the red glow of a fire shone out through the mist like a welcoming beacon. A looming silhouette hid the actual flames, a slender neck curling upwards from a dark bulk on the sand, by the look of it, the high prow of a ship. It did not seem to be of Ekwesh kind. That did not necessarily mean it was safe to approach, and he hefted the sword thoughtfully. The master smith had taught him enough swordplay and other warrior arts to judge what made a good or bad weapon, but he had never used them in anger, and was not eager to. There was no cover here at all. The sand was so flat he would gain nothing even by crawling up on his belly. He would just have to walk in openly and trust to his luck. He hooked his sword onto his belt again, but as he strode briskly across the crisp, damp sand, his hand hovered near the hilt. From time to time, great beams of light and shadow played up across the mist curtain as unseen figures crossed and recrossed in front of the flame. But he reached the dark side of the hull without challenge, and stood there a moment, resting a hand on the barnacled timbers. It came away slimy, flecked with weed fragments. As he slipped along the length of the vessel, he saw tangles of half-dry weed hung from a mass of twisted metal at the outthrust curve of the bows. Evidently, it was not long beached. He could hear voices on the far side, but no clear words. He must needs take his chance. Cautiously, he stepped around the bows, and found himself suddenly in a circle of firelight, with a host of astonished faces staring up at him. They were pale faces, mostly, but as wild and wolfish as any Ekwesh. Their eyes widened, and in an instant the whole crowd of them, 20 or more, were on their feet, with a hiss of weapons drawn. Elof held up his hands, then ducked violently as an axe flew past his head and boomed against the hull. Quickly he put his back to the wood, and swept out his own sword as the menacing semicircle of men closed in. "Stand back!" he shouted. "I don't mean you any—" A heavy blade cut out at his head, and he met it with a two-handed parry which tore it from its wielder's hand. His attackers fell back a pace, but a fat, fair-haired man in the middle bellowed and sprang forward, lunging at him with a halberd. As Elof jumped aside, the lunge became a sideways cut, and he had to swing round to fend it off. The halberd dug into the hull, was hauled out, and jabbed at him again. Elof flailed his sword out against it, and sent the fat man stumbling back. Furious at being harried, Elof shouted and leaped forward, whipping the black blade whistling round him, and his adversaries stumbled over each other in their haste to give ground. He heard someone shouting in the southern tongue for spears and bows, but the fat man stood his ground. Elof had to meet him, and aimed a chopping downward cut that should have made him jump. Instead, he brought up the butt of the halberd, and Elof's blade skidded ringing down the iron rods that bound it. Immediately the halberd seemed to spin round, the blade scythed at his throat. Elof cut at it with desperate strength. This time the sword struck the haft squarely, and sheared right through it, iron, wood, and all, leaving the fat man staring stupidly at his useless truncheon. Elof kicked the fallen blade behind him and stepped back. Maybe now they'd listen. He heard the pad of feet an instant too late, saw his other attackers jump back, and whirled to meet the man who came running around the prow. He saw only a blurred, crouching outline, taut and compact, and a flash of red hair. Then a long sword licked out to meet his. Elof hewed at it as he would a tree, and with all his strength, and the sheer force behind the ringing collision, sent the newcomer staggering back. But he recovered at once by spinning on his heel, and his sword leaped at Elof from an unexpected side. Elof just managed to parry, but the other's blade seemed to turn supple as a serpent and flow around his, till, with a sudden, violent twist, it wrenched it right out of his grasp. Every muscle and joint in Elof's hand shrieked with the pain of near dislocation, and he stumbled back, clasping it under his other arm. His sword thudded into the sand. A heavy boot rested on it. The other men raised their weapons and rushed forward with a yell, then stopped abruptly as they came up against the flat of a blade. The newcomer was holding them back as he looked Elof up and down. "Spears and bows just to deal with this?" he demanded coldly, in very clear southern speech. "One man." The fat man glowered. "If he is a man, don't look kinda to me. Came at us off the marsh, he did. Can't take chances." "I think we may delay butchering him long enough to ask a question or two." "Well?" the newcomer asked, turning to Elof again. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, I do," said Elof. He took a second to study his opponent before saying anything more. The man had attacked in a stance which made him seem small, a hard target, the ploy of a master swordsman. Now that he was standing straight, he was a full head taller than Elof, but much leaner and narrower, hard and ageless. His garb of dark green tunic and breeches, through which, though worn and stained, seemed plainer but sounder than the other's crazy blend of rags and soiled finery. It enhanced a certain dignity in his face. He had the same cast of features as Rock or Cathel, but less rounded, longer, and harder, with a stern, straight nose and firm cheekbones and chin, the pale skin gold-tinged by the sun. His hair was a darker, somber bronze red, his eyes blue-gray as the sea mist and as hard to penetrate. They had a calm, assessing quality which reminded Elof disturbingly of the mastersmith, but seemed somehow less alarming. "I meant no harm," Elof said. "I was lost on the marsh, wandering. I could not survive long out there without fire and shelter. I came to ask help." "With a drawn sword?" Elof bridled. "Not till your friends set on me, without giving me a chance to speak. I tried to be civil, but never had the chance. I see." He raised his eyebrows at the fat man, who was aggrievedly picking up the pieces of his halberd. "Well, it may be as you say, but do not blame these lads too much. You obviously know what manner of a place the marshlands are. Travelers are always very nervous of what might appear off them. Rightly so. How did you come to be lost in them? I dwell in them, said Elof, and there was a murmuring among the men. Some drew back, others hefted their weapons. I'm no spook, he said irritably. Over by the causeway. Then what are you messing about here for? Growled the fat man. There was nothing to be gained by telling these superstitious creatures the full story. I was exploring far afield for metal, and lost my way. Metal? Barked the swordsman, with a look of a bird of prey stooping. Yes, said Elof calmly. Iron, and old armor, for my trade. I'm a smith. Among the onlookers there was a sudden stir of interest, even of relief. The fat man rounded on them, but the swordsman snapped his fingers. The causeway? That's right. I'd heard there was a causeway smith again, this last year or so. And you have a smith's sinew, that's for certain. He turned to the fat man. What say you? A stroke of good fortune at last? I'd make a change. If he's what he says, if we can trust him, if he's any good, I'll me drink, but at least you knew where you were with him. I mean, what's Smith worth a damned set up there, of all places? Why don't you try me and find out? Growled Elof, cold and hungry and irritated beyond measure. An admirable suggestion, Smith, said the swordsman. By your speech, you're a northerner. Do you know anything of ships? Elof shook his head. I've only ever been on one, and that by no will of mine. I know nothing of their making. The swordsman sighed. Well, neither did our last smith, and you cannot be any worse than he. See, Smith, we were damaged in a sea fight, barely limped back to this beach of ours, and the only smith among us dead. Not in the fight, but of his drinking. Come and see. By your leave, skipper? The fat man grunted, but let them pass and trailed along behind with the other men. The woodwork we've managed, said the swordsman, though there are precious few good trees in these parts. But there's the worst of it. There, at the keelscarf. He gestured at a point just under the outward curve of the prow, where a scarf joint secured by heavy trenails joined the long single timber of the keel to the rising forestem timber. Here were the roots of that tangle of metal, braced against both timbers. Elof, peering past the weeds, could see that the metal had once been a great harpoon head of steel, with a comb of barbs along its heavy shaft. Outthrust beyond the bows, it must turn the whole ship into a gigantic spear, but now it hung sadly askew. The barbs twisted and cracked. Our remmingskeg, said the swordsman. What you northerners would call yarnskeke, I believe. The iron beard. Without it, we've no chance against bigger ships. If you can make that hole for us again, you're welcome to fire and a blanket and such food as we have. Well, Elof stepped forward to peer at the wreck, wondering furiously just who these men were. The fat man and the others could easily be corsairs, but this big swordsman spoke like something better than a brigand, or at least more intelligently. Elof had more sense, though, than to ask outright, at least for now. He bent all his attention to the broken skeg, running his fingers over the twisted metal. It had been solid and sound once, but there must have been one impact too many. Suddenly, he straightened up and swore. This was damaged before, wasn't it? The swordsman looked tellingly at the fat skipper, who ducked his head unwillingly. Aye, 'twere so. A few months gone. Almy fixed it good enough. He did not. Look here, and here at the barb. These are cracks, but there's rust inside them, and some other filth. He must have just covered them over, so no wonder they've failed you now. And he's just soldered the break, where it should have been forged fast again. Typical, murmured the swordsman. Well, Smith, it speaks well for you that you're so keen of eye. But can it be remade now? Oh, easily enough, began Elof casually, and then faltered. An awful ache of loss and helplessness settled on him, so strongly it must have showed. The captain's face hardened, and he looked significantly at his men, but Elof caught his breath. If I had my tools here, that is. Naturally enough, I wasn't carrying them when I got lost. Naturally enough, said the swordsman unconcernedly. Down by the fire there you'll find almies. I was about to try to use them in default of all else, but I know of this art only from books. I would not set myself against any smith, and least of all a northerner. Will they do? Elof handled them distractedly. They're poor things for the most part. The only good ones among them old and worn beyond belief, and little or no feeling of power or even personality on any of them. Only now, encountering a lack of it, did he realize how strong it had been in his own and the mastersmith's gear. I can't imagine how your southern smiths manage without it. But the faces around him, even the darker-skinned ones, ranged from baffled to contemptuous. Even the swordsman's bore a look of tolerant amusement, as at a popular superstition. So even a southron with some reading, wide reading if he'd studied smithcraft, made nothing of the true craft. If only he could show them. It might be that he could. They'll do, he said. Yes, I can repair it, but I'll need a proper anvil. I'll need a little block of metal he used, grunted the captain. Popped it up on a stump or anything handy. That'll do. Very well, I expect. And a better forge. You can build one here on the beach with stones like this. He drew a square box fireplace on the sand. We can improvise bellows of a sort, but if the wind gets up, we can pull out a few stones on the right side and channel that instead. Clever, murmured the swordsman. And how long? Elof shrugged. A day and a night. Too long, barked the swordsman, with a sudden lash of anger that triggered Elof's own. That's no damned fault of mine, he snapped, standing up and glaring furiously into the lean, hard face, fists clenching. Oddly enough, it was the captain who intervened. Let him alone. I'll me take a week, and you or I longer if we did it at all. You want to give him a whack, make it a fair whack. There's a good chance we can still catch him in that time. Slowly, the lean man relaxed, and Elof realized that he had been tense and worried all this time. Many lines smoothed out of his brow, and suddenly he looked only a few years older than Elof, in his mid-20s at most. So, he said, I agree. we should be grateful for what we have. To work, then, my lad." "After I've eaten, by your kindness," said Elof calmly, "and slept a bit. I'll need that to give you of my best. Oh, and had my sword back, if you please. I still can't do much till the forge is built anyway." The captain growled his wrath, but the swordsman laughed suddenly. "Very well. I will go bail for your good faith. You shall eat and rest while we labor on it. That is fair exchange for our rough handling. The sword, though—" He turned and scooped it up from the sand, and hefted it admiringly. "A fair blade. I confess I covet it, and I did best you of it." Elof frowned. "But that only makes me understand your concern all the better. I was going to say you would have it when you were done, but you might rest ill without it. Here." He passed it over formally, hilt forward across an arm. Elof took it, and bowed equally formally. "You are generous, and I will honor your trust. I will do the very best I can in the least time." The swordsman nodded. "A fair-spoken smith for your boldness. My name is Kermorven, second in command of this desperate crew under Captain Irmahal here. May I know yours?" "Elof, smith of the causeway, now of no guild or master." "And all the better for that, I am sure," said Kermorven lightly. "Well, Elof, you'll be wanting your food and rest. Mail, do you go and find him some. The rest of you, up, about, and find big stones, flat if you can, and bring them up the beach there." Later, when his stomach was full, and he was winding himself in a coarse blanket by the fire, Elof thought over all that had happened. It had been a dangerous spot, that, at first. But he had been right to be bold with this Kermorven fellow, who seemed to be the real power in the crew. It had got him what he wanted. Or had it? With a slight shock, he realized that the swordsman's generosity and courtesy had effectively turned the whole scene on its head, had been calculated to do so. He was now under obligation to these people, instead of the other way round. For a moment, he bridled at that, but sighed. It would only bind a man of honor, which meant that Kermorven considered him one. It was a compliment of a sort, but a mightily awkward one, when he had no idea who these cutthroats were, or what use they would make of that fearsome skeg. But he simply could not worry about all that now. His whole frame was one leaden ache of exhaustion. The soft sand drifted away from under him. To his surprise, Kermorven was waiting by the newly built forge, tapping experimentally on the little anvil erected next to it. The clear, ringing knifed through Elof's head. He had slept no more than an hour or two, after missing what might be one day, or one night, or many. But the swordsman was eager to be about the work, for which they first had to detach the tangled mess from the prow. That meant hammering parts of it away above and below to get at the big, rusty bolts. And while Elof was perched on a stack of sea chests, straining at one of these, his hand barked painfully against a rod that felt like wood, not metal. Reaching down into the tangle, he found it was a heavy catapult arrow, stuck into the hull timbers, and he worked it loose with his pincers. But as he pulled it out, he let out a gasp of surprise, for he remembered those black and white fletches only too well. Kermorven looked up from the bolt he was working on and nodded. Yes, Smith, those are our enemies. And if I guess right, yours also. It is the Ekwesh we fight, and in that lies our need for haste. Between them, they manhandled the unwieldy ram up the sand to the forge. From what we hear, Kermorven panted, a strong flotilla will be sailing northward along this stretch of coast before night tomorrow, and it would burn my heart to let them pass unchallenged. Elof nodded fiercely and turned to stoke up the forge fire. Then haste you shall have, and anything else I can bring to the work. There were words he remembered, fragments of chants, snatches of verse, that had to do with the striking power of spearheads. If some of those could be adapted to the ram, if he had truly seen more than the firelight in that sword hilt, then a thought struck him, and he turned again in sharp and sudden puzzlement. You say northward? When the Ekwesh are on their way home? But why not attack when they're headed south in the first place, before they've done their pillaging? Then he saw the look on Kermorven's face. Oh, he said, I see. It is the only way they will give battle, said Kermorven, his face sullen and defensive. When there is loot to be gained, profit to be made. They are corsairs, after all, these lads. I cannot change their nature all at once. They are few, and must lurk here in the cover of these mists, picking off a boat at a time here and there. But at least they will fight. And that's more than anyone else I could find. Elof stood there, horrified. The true import of what he had heard only just coming home to him. You mean the Ekwesh have come this far and beyond, into the rich south itself? And nobody will resist them, not even here? Not after what happened to the first who tried. Every year they have grown bolder, working their way down the coasts of your lands and near to Kerbrahine, that you call Suderny, till at last a sizable fleet came to harry our northern ports. The marsh warden of these parts, a powerful lord, and a kinglet in his own domain. He grew impatient waiting for the syndics to act. He raised his own levies against the raiders without waiting for help from the city. By weight of numbers, it should have been enough to obliterate them 10 times over. But the levies were cut down to a man, an utter rout and massacre. So now, nobody will march against the raiders. But we always thought of you Southrons as so rich, so powerful, with high walls to dwell behind, and armies no lord would dare challenge. I don't understand it. Kermorven shrugged. We have armies, but no fighters. Captains, but no leaders. We have been at peace too long. No bad thing save that we cannot now preserve it. The syndicacy is all the government we have now. A gaggle of fat men who cannot agree the time of day without a full session in council. The March Warden, being charged with the peace of our northern borders, he had more knowledge of war than most, but that only in skirmishes with reavers in the debatable lands, and corsairs such as we. And the syndics squat behind the city walls and find reasons in their purses not to fight, hoping the blow will not fall in their time. He drew a deep breath. And since they cannot vent their fears on the cause of them, instead they do so upon any who, never mind, something must be done, however little, to convince the barbarians that they will not have the Southlands to themselves as they have had Norderney. My folk didn't just lie down before them, said Elof sharply, levering at a cracked joint with heavy pincers, surprised at how easily he could forgive the poor folk of Assenby now. They fought. Aye, said Kermorven, when they had no other choice, I would wager. So, no doubt, will mine, when the enemy is at their gate. But by then, it will be too late, because he will have dealt with the country piecemeal, as he did with yours, instead of finding it a solid bulwark against him. If they could wipe out the March Warden's troops without crippling loss to themselves, then no one region or town, not even the city itself, can stand against them alone. Elof nodded, remembering the well-fed complacency of Hartheby, while the ruins of Assenby, only a few days' sail away, were still smoking. Was Hartheby yet standing? You have the right of it. So it has been with us, indeed. To his surprise, Kermorven shook his head. I blame your land much the less. It has never been united, nor had much chance to be. Its first settlers deliberately chose independence over dominion. And I shall not say they were wholly wrong. Elof looked at him, surprised. This was a man of lore, in his way, and no mere sword-swinger. You seem to know more of the histories of the North than I do. I used to think my master had led me deep into knowledge, and so he did, but along a very narrow path I now see. Tell me something of this lore as I work. As we work, said Kermorven, more cheerfully. And at first he did his best to make his boast true. In the taking apart of the damaged ram, his wiry, unflagging strength was a great help, but he had scant breath left for talking. When that was achieved, though, there was little he could do save stand and watch Elof at his filing and hammering and grinding, and take a turn at the crude bellows when needed. Then he did indeed tell many tales, as the night wore on, in the tongues of both South and North, in which he seemed almost equally fluent. Elof could only marvel at how little he had known before of either Norderney or Sudenry, and the wider world around them. Of the land of Caris, the swordsman told, now a name of legend, no more, and of how the first coming of the ice was there foreseen, and of the many of its two kindred peoples who then ventured across the wide oceans to settle in the eastern lands of this vast country they called Brassael, hoping that their children would live free of its malice forever. But that was not to be, said Kermorven, the dark burr of the north as deep in his voice as any native's. And when, after many generations, the ice made its dread way down towards them, there was division in their state. As our Southlands are today, it was centered around the great city known as Stragenberg in your tongue. The city by the waters, heart and mind of its realm, and to which the other towns, even their first strong settlement on the eastern shore, were as mere outposts. They dearly loved that place, high and fair, mirroring the lost splendors of Caris. But many in terror of the ice now wished to abandon their lands altogether, and to flee southwards and westwards, despite the dangers of the forest and the mountains in the heart of this land, which they must either brave or skirt around. But They did not know how long that would take, or even if it was possible, or whether it would lead them to habitable lands at all. In the end, it came to a sundering of the kindred. Most of one chose to go, most of the other chose to stay. Those who stayed had come originally from the more northerly ranges of Kiris, and perhaps yet endured the worsening cold more gladly. Their kings, though, came of both peoples blended many times over. They stayed, and tried to persuade or compel as many as possible to do the same. But the others fled. He fell silent for a moment as Elof chanted a scrap of harsh verse over one of the tines of the comb, and he stood staring into the forge flames. Shining steel, spirit of falcon, spear point, mark you my word, as a shaft of sunlight cleaves the cloud roof. Strike asunder where you are sent. Some called them brave, said Kermorven at last, to undertake so perilous a journey. Others said that by fleeing, they were only serving the will of the ice, and called them cowards and fools for choosing to risk terrors unknown, rather than helping preserve what they could of their own hard-won domain. Myself, I do not know, but I think I would have stayed. As it befell, in the end, there was much bravery on both sides, for the ones who fled came across the mountains to these warm southlands only after many trials, and a good half of their number perished along the way. There are tales of high heroism and great sacrifice in the journey, and the forging of the new realm. But in the east also, there were heroes. Then, if ever, lived Vade, and many other mighty names. They held the realm together for 2 generations more, as the cold grew worse around them, and the ice and all it brought with it came sweeping across their northern borders. But in the end, it made a great spearhead southward, and the glaciers came right up against the whole proud city by the waters and ground it to powder beneath them. And there it lies to this day. Then those who were left abandoned their kings in bitterness, who had persuaded them to stay, and they too fled. Some went to the lesser towns in the east, but a good number went in the wake of their brethren, west and south. Many perished. Some won through, at a cost even more appalling than their forerunners, for they were fewer and ill-prepared. That, too, was a time for heroes. But they found scant welcome in the birth pangs of the new realm of Kerberheim, for the bitter words and names once given had not lost their force, and some, it is said, yet lived who had endured them. So against heroism must be set great cruelties, and treachery and villainy on both sides. In the end, the newcomers left their brethren and escaped to the more northerly parts of the lands between mountains and sea, which the first come, preferring warmer climes, had not cared to settle. There, as time passed, they met and mingled with fellow refugees, brown-skinned folk from far westward across ocean and ice. And that was the origin of your Northlands. The new settlers made widely scattered settlements, for the Northerners had always been the outlivers of Caris and the Eastlands. But without a central city to serve, this left them poor and weak. And though the enmity between North and South long ago grew cold, and there has been trade and a measure of friendship between us for many centuries, still the cities of the North cannot combine with each other to defend themselves, let alone with us. The habit of independence is grown too strong. Elof nodded somberly, watching the two ends of a weld begin to glow in the fire. I remember my own little town. The only link with the world beyond the walls, the guilds and the traders, and the word of headmen and elders, the only law. They would never dream of submitting to a greater. Yes, it was only reinforced by the brown-skinned folk, for they were fleeing the bloody rise of the Ekwesh Empire, and feared nothing more than creating another. They were peaceful farmers and fishers, not used to looking much beyond soil, sea, and season, and they had paid their own toll in blood to find that peace. The settlers then were realizing how few they were against the South, which they feared, and how slow to increase. Small wonder they made these sturdy newcomers welcome. So today's Northerners are a good folk, but ever an inward-looking one. And that is a perilous thing to be when the ice is shaping its malice against you. Elof put his hammer down a moment and looked at him. My master talked as you do about the ice, as if it was a living thing. Kermorvan's eyes widened. But it is. He told you no more than that? He shook his head in wonder. Then it was no narrow road your master led you down, but a crooked one. Know what every child of our land learns. There is indeed a living will behind the ice, and a malign one. It, or they, for it is said there may be more than one, hates all living things. I do not know why, but it does. Most of all, it hates us, we humans, and what little order and civilization we have won for ourselves. It may make use of men for a time, but it seeks to drive us back to the level of the beasts, so that it may destroy us as freely as they. Thus it especially hates we of Kerberhain, furthest from its grasp, strongest against its purpose. The ice is its weapon, slow but inexorable in its advance. Did I not tell you how it spearheaded south to cover the great city? Nowhere else has it yet dared come so far, though it chafes ever at the mountains north of your land. That I know, said Elof quietly, as he drew the pieces from the fire and set them together with a rain of light taps. I have heard it. You have heard? Kermorvan shook his head, momentarily lost for words. Then he burst out. But how did you dare go so close? The ice is not empty, but peopled with fearful creatures, fell beasts, and other terrible things that I can give no names to. That will draws them as it draws all unhallowed things. They ride the ice as they might a ship, and fare ahead as its vanguard, spreading death and terror. They come wherever its power is strong, at times even down to the marshes here with its meltwaters. How did you dare? Elof was silent a moment. The hammer stood poised in his hand, but did not fall. For he was thinking, remembering, as he had not for a long time. His first sight of the gleam in the sky, and the mastersmith telling of his pilgrimage, his new apprenticeship, his reshaping, reforging, upon the Anvil of Ice. Savagely, Elof smote down upon the weld, with blows so fast and heavy that the sparks went dancing and skittering across the little anvil, and the pieces of hot steel seemed to flow together as one. He looked up to see Kermorven gazing at him with keen eyes. "I was astray," he said, but nothing more. Kermorven shrugged. "Who in this world is truly astray, I wonder? There are other powers than those of the ice, they say. Certainly, it was a timely strain that led you to us." He looked questioningly at Elof, seemed about to ask something outright. Elof hastily turned away and plunged the fastened metal into the improvised quenching trough, and was grateful for the concealing cloud of steam that arose around him. There were too many questions he did not yet wish to answer, even to himself, least of all to this strange man, who had been careful to say so little of himself. And it was as if Kermorven himself sensed that, and approved, for he added, "At least, timely, if I do not keep us from our work." He looked around him at the first faint tinge of gray in the mist. "Dawn approaches. How long? 7 hours? Perhaps 8? And another hour to refit it, I think. The mount should be reinforced." Kermorven growled. "Let us hope we have that long, then. These chants of yours, these cymbals you're scratching, will they really achieve anything?" Elof smiled as he selected 2 more strips of metal and jabbed them into the fire. "That's to be seen. They are not slowing my work, not by more than minutes." "No? Those minutes may count." He spoke harshly, in the effort to rein in his eagerness. "But go ahead. You must work as you know best how." "I thank you," said Elof, and meant it. Once again, a compliment. Once again, a burden of responsibility. This Kermorven did know how to sway people to his purposes. I think they are worth trying, though they will be less effective on something not new made. You understand, it is not the power of the art that I doubt. It is myself." Kermorven, suddenly nonchalant again, rubbed a thumb over his stubbled chin. "Then I think you need have no fears." Elof shrugged, turning the metal in the forge. "We will see, in a few hours. Perhaps. And what then, Elof?" "You set out to fight the Ekwesh." "And you?" I turned for home." Elof plucked out the longer piece and began to straighten it. "Though, if you could set me ashore above or below the heart of the marshlands, it would make my path shorter and safer." He hesitated and did not know why. Kermorven appeared not to notice. "We cannot leave this area before we fight, here where there is always mist to cloak us. And we cannot return to it afterwards, not for weeks. The fleet may stay and search, or leave a force to trap us. So we can only land you if you take ship with us now." He leaned forward fiercely, and red forge light shone against his keen gray eyes. "Why not, Elof? It'll be uneven enough as it is, 50 of us to maybe 100 of them. Someone like you might well turn the scale." Elof snorted. "I'm no warrior." "No? If you're not, who is? You're strong, even for a smith, and fast. You've some swordplay at least. And you hate the Eqwesh, that's clear. So come with us." "Aye, come," grunted the captain, stumping up through the mist. "Got the better of me, and there's not so many ears can say that, Kermorvan. And speaking of that, if you've a moment, perhaps you wouldn't mind fixing some bands on a new albard shaft." Elof gave a splutter of laughter. "That, at least, and once that won't cleave so cleanly. For the rest, we'll see. Now somebody put their back to those bellows, or we'll never have this thing straight." The sun stood past noon before he had done, and the mists had thinned to a heavy haze. A new, strong mounting was prepared, and the reforged ram swiftly bolted into place. At once the captain had the corsairs scurrying about to raise the mast and reload their gear. But Kermorvan seemed unable to tear himself away from the weapon, running fascinated fingers over the dark, menacing gleam of the metal. "I take back my words," he said with strong exhalation. "You have made this a finer thing than ever it was. Stronger, sharper. There's a faint, strange shimmer on it." Sprawled exhausted on the warm sand, Elof took a moment to understand what he was hearing. Then abruptly he rolled over and scrambled up, eager to look, but hardly daring. What was a swordsman seeing? Could it be that he also had a touch of the art in his blood? "Like fish darting in a pool," added Kermorvan, entranced. "As if sunlight truly were forged into it, as they tell of the Duergar smiths of old. I waste time, but now we've a real chance." He turned away to call for ropes and rollers to be readied. Gingerly, Elof reached out and touched the warm metal, peered at it, into it. Under the greenish sheen of the steel, a light coursed indeed, now strong, now pale, pulsing like blood in veins. The work, crude as it was, had come alive under his hands. On impulse, he plucked his sword up from where it lay by his cloak and jerkin on the sand, and gazed hard at the hilt he had made. Clouds gleamed back at him through the sky, though the sky above was clear, glancing and shifting in the mesh, vagrant as thoughts. The realization, the honing of hopes he had deliberately dulled, was almost painful, like stirring a limb long unused. But there was no escaping it, and pleasure in the very pain. He should have suspected as much the moment he touched the clumsy old hammers and pincers, felt the emptiness in them. He had not even noticed it in his work for Joran. It took power to perceive power, and the lack of it. With a surging yell of sheer joy, he hurled the sword wheeling into the air and caught it, closing his fingers round the cool glitter of the hilt, clutching it to him. What it might be he could not guess, but a virtue dwelt in that hilt. His art was his again, and his long healing complete. "A martial sight you are, of a sudden," laughed Kermorvan, striding up the beach. "Well, Sir Smith, are you then thinking of coming to fight alongside us, or of slinking away to rot in your smithy, assuming you'll ever find it again?" Elof thrust the black blade vertically down into the sand, to stand like some sinister outgrowth. How strange that he should have worked some quality into the hilt and not know its purpose. But then, what did he know of his own now? Go back to the marshes and live as before? The fenland had seemed so right for him once, a place of hiding, not so much from the master smith as from his own self-loathing, a bitter purge needed for a mind made sick. He had found punishment in suffering, and made some restitution, perhaps. There were many travelers now safe who would not have been but for him. And in that, it seemed, he had also found healing. Now, for all their bleak loneliness, the fenlands had almost become a safe haven, a retreat where he could go on living a simple, useful life with few demands beyond staying alive, forgetting his cares and fears. But was he right to forget them, now his health and his craft had come back to him? Was it right to go on hiding? The world marched on and would not wait for him, squatting in the rush beds. What of his vengeance on the Eqwesh? What of his debt to Rock? What of his pledge to Kara? And what of the grim power he had unwittingly set in the hands of a ruthless man? For a moment he felt bewildered, but a moment only. Then he nodded, at once angered and amused. Whatever strange power had brought him here, it had chosen its time with care. The Eqwesh were growing bolder, and he aided them who failed to resist them. Whatever good he could do in the smithy, he could do more in the world beyond. And there was so much of that to see, so much to learn, and he was yet young. He turned to Kermorven and plucked the sun-warmed blade from the sand. His path was set clear before him. "All right, you southern pirate, I'll come, but on one condition only, that when this fight's done, if I choose, I'll count myself quit, and you'll set me ashore then within easy reach of a town, and food and gear to get there. Agreed?" "So be it," barked Kermorven with gusto. "We could clasp hands on it, but I've another idea. It's still too clear to launch. The Eqwesh would spot us leagues off. We must needs wait. That maddens me. So as well pass the time making you some semblance of a swordsman. Shall we cross blades on it?" Kermorven's long sword hissed out, gray steel glittering before eyes that matched it. Elof grinned, and the black blade gleamed in sullen magnificence. He copied the stance Kermorven had used. "Fair trade for the smithcraft I've taught you." So they swung and sparred through an hour or more of the afternoon, edge on edge chiming through the thickening haze. The loafing corsairs gathered round to watch and laugh as Elof was stung by the flat of the grey blade, or sent sprawling on his face with the surf lapping round him like an anxious dog. They had all suffered under Kermorven's instruction. But soon enough, as a mist came rolling in across the little bay, they ceased to laugh, and nodded thoughtfully, and laid small wagers against the coming plunder. For Elof's sheer strength told against the subtlety he lacked, and the same eye and hand that placed blows so accurately on the anvil, he could turn against his opponent. At length, hilts locked, they swayed eye to eye, breath hissing through dry lips. "Better," Kermorven gasped. "One day, a great manslayer, had you only the will." "Sooner beat metal than men," wheezed Elof. The tall man laughed and was about to answer when there came a shout from the high dunes behind the beach. "Sail ho! South away! A black sail!" "Hands to launch!" bellowed the captain, bounding to his feet. "Shift your scuts to the ropes!" Kermorven dropped his guard and sheathed his sword in one fluid movement, and went pounding off to join the other corsairs, dragging Elof with him. A spring cable, rigged between the stern post, a solid old tree stump, and the bow capstan, pulled the vessel forward on its rollers, while those crewmen not straining at the capstan bars rushed back and forth, taking rollers out from under the stern and thrusting them under the advancing bows. Elof, scrambling over the stern, was amazed nobody was crushed, but it was a practiced operation, and the long, sleek hull slipped into the oily, calm waters of the bay with hardly a splash. The mist curled around her low gunwales, and wreathed itself around the legs of the roller crewmen being hauled aboard, as if it wanted to hold them back. Many of the men clutched amulets, or made superstitious signs. Even Kermorven rested his forehead against the mast a second, muttering low words. Elof, for his part, simply looked back at the shore, but it was already no more than a shadow in the mist, and even the marshy odor was lost in the myriad smells and stenches of the ship, from tar and damp sealskin sleeping bags to unnamed foulness in the bilges. The captain brought a heavy oilcloth bundle forward, and as he unwrapped it, carefully the bow lanterns glinted on a great beast head, carved and gilded, with staring eyes of red glass and long jaws filled with brass fangs. He reached up and fixed it into a socket atop the forestem, so it rode high over the bows as if on an arching swan neck. "Amicak!" cried the crew, and cheered wildly. Elof shuddered. "Why do they bear the sea devourer so gladly as an emblem?" he whispered to Kermorven. "What better sign for a corsair?" said the swordsman darkly. "A terror, a scourge, and a curse. That may very well be our ensign. We are outlaws, or exiles, who might as easily be slain by our own folk as our enemies." He laughed bitterly. "Perhaps we have made our own compact with the devourer. We send him food, or are ourselves sent down to feed him. Why should we not claim his protection? Out with your sweeps there! Fix locks!" The oarsmen took their benches, and the long, heavy sweeps were passed out over the gunwales and mounted on the heavy pivot pins that served as rowlocks. They were held poised for a moment, as if about to row through mist rather than water. But as the captain gave the word and struck his halberd upon the deck, they dipped and strained in perfect unison, and the lean craft lifted its bows and flew forward, the dark, glassy water chuckling and gurgling delightedly around the new ram. Someone began to sing softly, and after a moment the others took it up, a slow, rather sad shanty in time with the stroke. "Riding the waters, fair is she, fair the body of Scythena sea maiden, streaming her tresses, bright as sun, white her breasts, the gulls rode creston. Body so slender, pale as foam, silken her flanks, through sea swell gliding." Kermorven's clear voice rang out over the chorus. "Scythena, come to me, leave me not drifting, sleeping so lonely, where tideway takes me, and the cold claws tear." "Aye, let 'em call on Scythena where they may," grumbled the skipper to Elof. "For d'ye know, Sir Smith, that she's the promise of drowned men. Now we'll needs thrash about till we find the bleeders, and that's chancy business in night and murk. But that's when it must be, added Kermorven calmly, for we cannot match the Eqwesh in daylight and under sail. But they are poor navigators, and sail always by following the coasts, and in that is our hope. They must pass the delta, where there is always mist somewhere, and in that we may have them. He stared out into the thickening fog, where Elof could see nothing. An instant later, Kermorven rapped out an order, and the shanty died away. He rested an ear against the gunwale, as if listening. Passing the headland rocks by that swell, skipper? The captain listened a moment, and nodded. Elof felt the gentle rise and fall beneath his feet grow slower and stronger as they moved out into open sea, though there was still only the faintest breath of a breeze. Right, then, added Kermorven. Douse lanterns, muffle your rowlocks, batten down anything loose, and most of all, your mouths, for there'll be no more shouted orders. We want to hear those riving bastards before they hear us, remember? Stick to it, then, and this voyage'll see us all rich men. One subdued cheer answered him, and then a silence thicker than the fog fell about the ship. He turned to Elof. Do not think the worse of me for holding out the promise of riches. I need them myself. How so? His hard fist thumped the tiller of the steering oar. To buy and equip ships of my own. To strike before the raiding, and not have to hover like vultures over the kill. We've engaged 4 Eqwesh ships so far, and taken 3, and I, poor exile as I am, I have saved all my shares. Little enough so far, but I was not then second in command. Tonight, we may see. Hours passed, and the corsair beat about, back and forth, searching for some trace of its foe. Kermorven and the captain plotting their position only by the changing sounds of tide and current. A rare puff of wind would thin the fog, but for the most part the sail hung empty and lifeless, bedewed with the damp. While the corsairs strained at the oars and grew ever more tired and disheartened. Many said the Eqwesh must already have gone by them. Elof took turns rowing, then on watch, standing in the high bows behind the hideous head, one hand tight on the forestay. He glanced down at the ram, cleaving the low swell beneath him, no longer sure he had done right to come, or whether he trusted the swordsman's words. This clammy chill fogged his feelings, forever blank, pallid, silent. Or was it? He leant forward suddenly, holding his breath so that it would not drown the faintness of the sounds he heard. Creaks, splashes, rumbling of water under a hull, like an echo of the sounds from the ship beneath him, but far, far away in the paleness of the dawn. Could this somehow be a trick of the mist, mirroring and dispersing sound as it did light? But he listened again, held his breath longer till he almost choked, thought he heard the laughter of harsh voices, as if the echo came now out of dark dreams of his youth. He slipped back down onto the deck and passed word aft to the captain and Kermorven. The oars were stilled. The crew rose and lined the gunwales, listening. And now the sounds grew clearer, drew even closer, till there was no mistaking them. "But whither away?" puzzled the captain. "Ere 1 minute, there the next. Can't get hold of them all." "From ahead there," said Elof. "Off the port bow. No, starboard, and moving up. But that drum's astern." "Quiet!" hissed Kermorven suddenly, and rounded on the rowers in fury. "Back to your sweeps, damn you, and row! Row for your lives! Helm, due north, and be ready for anything. Archers, to your posts! They're all around us!" The corsair boat surged forward. A momentary breath of wind arose around it, and the mist rippled like a sail and grew briefly thin. Every man on board ducked down in that moment, save Kermorven, and he stood rooted to the spot. In the faint light, long dark shadows, half again their own length, and higher in the water, went knifing through the swell on every side. Not just one, or two, but 20 at the least. Then the breeze slackened, and they blessed the mist as it fell again. There was no alarm, no hail of challenge, no creak of catapult winders. The watch had not noticed them. Kermorven grabbed Elof by the shoulder. "Into the bows, you and Mael, and listen out well. There was one running in towards the shore. We can take him right now if we're quick. Boarding party, arm! Helm!" Elof scrambled back to his perch, with Mael the boatswain on his heels, and they hung there listening, relaying whispered commands back to the helm, as dark outlines loomed out of the mist around them. A faint thudding rhythm drummed through the hull under them, and the rise and fall of the oars quickened in time with it. The bows leaped and plunged hissing through the dark, smooth ocean. Corsair craft weaved on an insane race through the fleet, slipping under bows and bouncing over wash. "Aft, Mael," said Kermorven's voice from behind them, "and to your post. We're through the thick of them now, and on his heels. Hear?" Ahead of them now was a deeper, slower sweep of oars, the low rumble of a drum, and harsh voices chanting. Something or somebody was not chanting, but wailing, on a high, rising note of utter misery. Old memories rose bitter in Elof's throat. He turned to Kermorven. "Well, where shall I—" He stopped in astonishment. In the figure that stood there he saw nothing of Kermorven. A high helm of dully gleaming metal, richly worked, reared on his head, and below it a mask visor in the form of a face, regal and proud, but with a dire rage and cruelty in its slanted eyes and flared nostrils. A shining steel collar circled the throat, and below that a casing of dark mail from head to toe, set with plates at shoulder, arm, and knee, and bound about with a great belt of leather bearing axe and long dagger. A long fur cloak hung from his shoulders, mailed boots covering his feet, and steel gauntlets ringing with heavy faceted studs covering his hands, in which a great two-handed sword stood bare. Only mouth and chin were left clear of the metal, and the set of the thin lips accorded well with the vicious mask above. Like the statue of some war god brought to life in that fell mist he seemed, or some deadly machine of destruction. Even his voice was tinged with metal. "They grow bold indeed, those eaters of man's flesh. They amble home where once they would have fled." He paced forward, wrapping the cloak about him to muffle the ring of the mail. "Nevertheless, they will be ready to fight quickly enough, and they have one deadly way to meet our attack. The very blades of their sweeps are set with steel edges and kept sharp, so they can be swung along the gunwales of a foe alongside, with terrible effect. No boarding party can pass, unless a way through is cut at once, before their archers can muster. A murderous task, standing and hacking at those sweeps. For that you need a strong sword and a stern will. I know, for I took that post in our last attacks, and many perished because I could not lead the boarding party. Will you take it now? Elof looked at him, and after a second he nodded. Where must I stand? He asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. Kermorven led him a little way aft, to where 10 crewmen were gathering, bearing all manner of blades and axes, but wearing as armor only light steel caps and studded leather jerkins, many of Equesh type, and small round shields. He could see how many might die without a fully armed man to lead them aboard. We have armor for you, if you will, no? Then here's your post, the hard mouth whispered. Up on the gunwales, with you the moment we strike, and keep a hold on the forward shrouds here. 2 sweeps at least we need cut away. A third, if you can manage. Then follow us, or stay to fight off any who try to board us in turn. But hopefully we keep them too busy for that little trick. So, we are ready. Hold tight now, all of you. The mask glared out into the mist, then aft to the tiller. Are we within range of her, skipper? Very well, then. Rowers, to ramming speed. The words were quiet, but there was a great shout in them. The drumming on the deck grew louder, faster, and the rowers flung themselves forward on their oars and back, gasping in great breaths as their backs strained, till the whole ship seemed to blow like one vast sea beast. It bounded forward, the serpent head reared up at the prow in imitation of its terrible original, and the mist flew by them in shredded streamers. A mad exultation seized Elof, and though he knew the risk, he sprang up to the gunwales, wrapping an arm round the Deadeye, to see his bright ram skeg go hissing across the water, like some vast arrow fired at the high, inchoate wall of black and white that loomed up clearer and clearer ahead. Then the bow wave under it swelled suddenly and steepened, funneled between the 2 holes. The mist exploded upward, and a giant hand plucked at his legs and lifted him off the gunwales. The deck dropped away from under him like a gallows floor. For an instant, he hung from the Deadeye by one arm, frantically clutching his sword. Then the deck swooped up to meet him again with a jarring, stinging impact. He reeled and saw a vast, flat serpent head rise and strike at him. He hewed wildly at its neck. There was a splintering of wood, and the sharp-edged sweep dropped away. He spun round on the shroud, leaned out as far as he dared, and hacked down on the next sweep. The shaft cracked and was driven downwards to jam against the planks of the Corsair ship, splintering there as both vessels rose in the swell. He was just swinging back to the other sweep when the shroud was plucked like a harp-string in his hand, and a figure swept past him from above, leaping into the gap he had opened, and crashing down on the rail of the Equesh ship. With a cry of "Morvan Morlenhall," Kermorven swung his huge blade, and Elof saw black-clad bodies bounce over the rail and slither down into the boiling water. Behind him, grapples were flung, hooked on, and the corsairs went swarming across to where he cleared a space. Then the next sweep lanced violently forward, and Elof barely managed to swing his legs up under him before it crashed into the deck where they had been, planing great swaths from the planking. His boots slammed down on the haft, jamming the blade deep in the deck, and he severed the head with a blow. On the Ekwesh rail above came a chorus of yells and screams, and he stared up unbelieving as a charge of Ekwesh warriors washed over the boarding party and broke in eddies of disarray against Kermorvan's sword. Now the masked figure was running forward, the boarders behind him in an arrowhead, and against the huge sword nothing stood, not shield or blade or the bodies of men. Kermorvan clove a clear path down the flank of the ship to the stern, out of sight. Elof saw an Ekwesh archer scramble up the foredeck for a clear mark, then be pitched overboard, skewered on an arrow shot from the corsair's stern. But another arrow sang down. One of the rowers coughed and sagged over his oar, and the others ducked, still pulling away at their killing pace. Archers were gathering behind the high rail, ready to fan the corsair with arrows and cut off the boarders. "Time we was open, Sir Smith!" bellowed the captain. He yelled something to his own archers and bounded across the gap. He barely made it, hung by his hands. 2 Ekwesh moved to shoot and fell with arrows in their throats as he clambered up. Shocked as Elof was by the bloodshed, something boiled over in him now. He scrabbled up the shroud till he was above the milling Ekwesh deck, waited a moment as the ships rose and fell, then sprang. An arrow grazed his side as he leaped. He landed, but fell askew and lost his sword. A dark-robed shape loomed up over him. He rolled aside, and a blade clove the deck by his ear. He kicked out hard. The robe collapsed like a tent, and he had his sword and stabbed down hard. The robe doubled up around it, convulsed once with a dreadful, choking yell, and was still. He staggered up, staring, appalled, fascinated at the gouts of scarlet on the black metal. He had shed it. Here was his revenge. And then an Ekwesh with a spear was running at him. He saw the spear rise and fall in remembered butchery and cut violently at it. The spear flew asunder around him. Its wielder stood an instant with a wide scarlet seam the length of his hide breastplate, then fell bubbling in a heap. Torn between horror and exultation, Elof staggered drunkenly down the pitching deck. The Ekwesh ship was being driven relentlessly away from the rest of the fleet as the corsair rowers kept up their thrust, and more of the Ekwesh oarsmen had to leave their oars to fight. High on the stern castle, bodies of archers strewn around him, stood Kermorvan now, a terrible figure in mail that ran scarlet, raining blows on the Ekwesh who came boiling up from below decks, to be hewn down before they could even join the struggle. Others clambered up through the rowing benches, but were caught by the corsairs as they reached the main deck. The air quivered with weapons clashing, the corsairs' hoarse war cries, and the jarring howls of the Ekwesh. Blood pooled on the deck, greasy and slippery underfoot, and Elof saw the headless body of a warrior go skidding right across it and tumble through a hatchway. Hysterical screaming erupted from beneath. Suddenly, he was back in the ruins of Assenby, with the old headman dead at his feet, and the women howling around him, being weighed up by those terrible eyes. And then the eyes were there before him, yellow and blazing with insensate hatred. With a horror of madness, he lashed out at them. Something bit burning into his shoulder. He saw a dark-robed figure go cartwheeling and spinning away down the deck, thin limbs flying in all directions. And only then knew he had struck down a real man, and no mere illusion. The sword that had grazed his shoulder clattered at his feet and went rolling after its wielder, who lay sprawled against the base of the stern castle. Elof stumbled forward and reached the stern castle just as Kermorven came clattering down the ladders, brandishing his sword, broken halfway down the blade, and hailed him. "That's it! She's ours!" Elof moved past him and turned over the figure of the man he had struck. The eyes glared back at him, wide open and alive, for all the great cut that had disabled his leg. "A chieftain, by his robe," said Kermorven, lifting it casually on his broken sword point. Something clattered at the man's belt, long as a dagger, and Elof stooped swiftly to snatch it away. But as the cold thing touched his fingers, he stared in utter amazement. A crook-headed shaft of bronze metal it was, a broad ring hooked through its lower end, the strange, rich patterns and characters on it half worn to glossy smoothness by the passage of many hands, many years. He knew it so well, yet saw it now with altered eyes. He clutched it tight, that well-remembered thing, and the wash of cold, yellow flame within seemed to shine between his fingers, to tingle against them, so strong was it. Had the old Ekwesh also perceived something, and kept it for that, as something numinous? "This," gasped Elof. "It came from my town. He was the animal who sacked it." "And many others, no doubt. We'll bind this carrion and take him aboard alive, lads. I would have words with him, and we have no time now." "All hands to unloading!" roared the captain. "Move your scuts! Do you want another shipload of these here savages around our ears? Strip this rat pit from stem to stern!" The corsairs scuttled this way and that, picking up discarded weapons and armor, stripping the dead of ornaments and prizing up the grills that covered the hold hatchways. Kermorven took no part in this, but went slowly to the rail, leaned on it, and fumbled to unfasten his helm with blood-greased fingers. Elof, hooking the goad to his belt, undid the fastening for him, and Kermorven sighed gratefully as he slid the mask off. It had left a deep bruise scored in his face. "Karis, that was sickening," he said, licking dry lips. "You looked to be enjoying yourself," muttered Elof, trying with trembling fingers to scrape the blood off his own sword. "So might you in the exercise of your craft and mystery," said Kermorven thinly, "forgetting for a moment where the sword you make may find a sheath. I am no berserk. I'm glad to have returned these beast folk to their own physic in full measure. Good weight, yes. But join it as they do? No. This is a larger ship than ever we have taken before, and more heavily crewed. By hell, what's that?" There was a sudden outbreak of noise from below decks, where most of the corsairs were foraging, and Elof remembered the screams he had heard. But before either of them could reach the main hatch, there was a trampling of feet, and a horde of women spilled on deck. Fair-skinned women, evidently Southrons, with one or two children clutched among them. At the sight of Kermorven in his gory armor, they stopped short, almost toppling lastcomers back into the hold, shrieked again, and huddled together. He looked almost as confused, gestured helplessly, and began trying to explain to them they were safe and would be taken back home. It was his red hair and clear voice that calmed them, more than anything he said, and the firm way he ordered the corsairs to look after them. They seemed almost as frightened of the corsairs as of the Ekwesh. At last, all 22 women were lowered one by one into the corsair ship, some shrieking and struggling in the rope harness. They were simple folk from farming villages, and most had never been in a boat before the raiders had seized them. Great bales of plunder were lowered after them, and last of all, the old chieftain. Some of the bolder women mobbed him as he was bundled down, clawing, kicking, and spitting. Then Kermorven swung himself down into the corsair's bows. 2 crewmen brought spear shafts forward. With them and Elof, he levered the ram free of the shattered timbers, and the 2 ships bobbed apart. "So easily freed," he marveled. But it bit deep as a dagger tooth, and not a mark on it, not a tine bent out of place. Smith, may I never mock your mumblings again. But Elof was looking up at the Ekwesh deck, where a dull red glow was rising. The captain bellowed at the rowers, and they pulled away. But before they had gone 2 strokes distance, flames crackled into the Ekwesh rigging, burned around the mast, and licked at the furled sail. They pulled harder for all their weariness, afraid of sparks in their own tarry rigging. And as the hulk retreated in the mist, they saw the bindings flare and the high sail come crashing down, to vanish in an instant in a sheet of fire. "I hope the devourer likes his meat cooked," said Kermorven dryly. "I found fire burning in some kind of shrine upon the stern castle, carefully enclosed in metal and brick. What smoked there as an offering, I will leave unsaid. I kicked it over. Now let them search." "But you want other ships," said Elof. "If you capture these—" "I cannot use them, and nobody would buy such things. I might infiltrate a fleet more easily, but after the fighting, I need smaller, faster craft like these. 10, 15 oars aside, not 30. Craft that can outrun the Ekwesh for short stretches, as we must do now, yet carry goods and men enough." He grimaced. "And women. I foresee trouble before all's done." But despite his misgivings, the women seemed to settle down well enough. More so, perhaps, because they had no homes to go back to. The corsairs, too, were quiet, for they had the exhaustion of battle and of rowing to keep them so. But great store of supplies had been captured from the Ekwesh, and they were promising themselves a feast ashore. 6 had been slain, another 2 had wounds they would die of, but the rest were luxuriating in the sheer joy of being yet alive. Kermorven and Elof and the skipper took their turns at the oars with the rest, and they kept up a fair speed. They had to row for some hours through the mists, but at last these thinned and blew away, and they were able to hoist sail and make northward for another of their secret landings, a small, hidden cove among the tall cliffs of a bay, invisible from seaward. Then Kermorven called crewmen to take his oar and Elof's, and went aft to where the Eqesh chief lay bound, guarded from the women's spite by a corsair too wounded to row. One woman plucked at Kermorven's sleeve as he passed. "Sir, let us at him. Please, She choked. "There was all our menfolk, even the little ones. Took us off a ship with our daughters, mine only 10. And then that one, he came and he took..." Kermorven looked at Elof. There was no girl of that age among the women. Had been none anywhere on the ship. Gently, he detached the sobbing woman's hand. "He lives only to tell us what he knows. You have looked on horror enough. I am sorry. I will see justice done for you, as befits my station." "I, or you," he added to Elof, as they waved away the guard, "for you have a score also to settle with this creature." Elof shook his head. "You may have the high justice. I do not. And whatever else, I see a sick old man." He stooped over him to loosen his bonds, and was spat at for his pains. You I remember now." He spoke the southern tongue quite clearly, as if he had been taught. "Many years, but I forget not. Brat the great shaman took." He leered horribly, and his breath wheezed in his throat. "Should have slain you then, eaten your liver, and him also may he rot, for he has brought me to this, me and my clan." "What?" said Kermorven in grim perplexity. "Just by sparing this one's life?" "No, fool," gasped the old man. He seemed to seethe with his grievance, and be only too willing to spit the venom of it at any who would listen. "Great warrior, even you will learn. Face him and learn. I am no fool. Would not have come south so far, so soon, but at his behest. Foolish counsel, while so much fat on bones of Northland. Too far, too soon, too little force." "Then why did you obey this man's behest?" said Kermorven quietly, kneeling down beside him. "Is he of a powerful clan?" "Clans!" The laugh was like nails scratched on slate. "He destroys clans, lowers chieftains, brings old ways of Ika Ia Washa down. Would have us unite with otter, eagle, frog, our old foes, to crush by the power of many like the ice. Some will do it. I say never many I speak for, till he wields his power. Then all is night. The heads bow before him. Fear none dare resist. Blade that never strikes a blow. My curse upon it, and the curses of all the ancestors of my clan, upon him, upon you, filth that you are, dung of the dog, beach carrion, couplers with animals, Mayesha Sakawa Hai." The chieftain's voice crackled and crowed away into mumblings in his own tongue. "Where was your fleet headed next?" demanded Kermorven. "Straight for home?" But the chief refused to speak any but his own tongue, even with Kermorven's sword at his throat, though he still stared around at them all with quick turns of the head and fierce yellow eyes, exactly like an ancient buzzard. He had had his say, and turned stubborn and silent the moment he was asked a question. "Pain will not move this one," said Kermorven at last. "Better make an end of it now. Elof, you have no more to ask of this old serpent? Elof?" Elof heard him, but he had sunk down in a heap on the deck. "What's the matter with you?" barked Kermorven. "You heard him," whispered Elof, clutching handfuls of empty air. "The man, the great shaman. Fear none dare resist. Blade that never strikes a blow. Kermorven, he was my master, and it was I who made that blade." The old chieftain heard and understood, for his cackling laughter rang high in the air. "Then may your own work skewer you. May the breasts of your daughters fill our cooking pots." But Kermorven was not a man to be trifled with. In a fury of loathing he spun round, and Elof heard the whistle and thud of the sword blade as it struck once, twice, again, and the laughter shrieked away into a whistling, gurgling scream, and was still. The women heard also, and raised a great clamoring cheer, and one voice shouted, "He didn't die easy!" "Throw that offal over the rail," barked Kermorven, and he stooped to Elof and raised him up. "I do not understand all I heard, but obviously you do. You will tell me more later, when we can be apart. But all I say this for now. I see no great evil in you. If something you have made finds an ill purpose, well, who better to unmake it? Think on that." It was 2 evenings after the attack that they wearily turned their bows in between the high cliffs of the northern cove, hauled its bows high into the silvery sand, and sank down in utter relief. They built a great fire then, for the cliffs would hide the smoke, and the weary corsair crew slept while the women cooked food and mulled wine from the barrels the Equish had taken. Then all ate and drank, the women with them, and their mood grew riotous. Elof, who would have sat apart, they embraced as a brother, and plied him with wine, praising his courage and great strokes that had cleared their way. He was the youngest of the crew, and well favored, and the women also made much of him, the younger ones fluttering around his neck or drawing him into the boisterous dancing around the fire. And he was nothing loath, for the wine had drowned his darker thoughts, and all his life he had known little of women. Kara's face danced before him a moment in the flames, but the arms round his neck he could feel. The lips against his own were warm, if not so fair. The bodies in his arms were firm, if not so slender. The fumes of the warm wine clouded his mind like breath on glass. He reeled, and 2 girls bore him up, one thin and red-headed, the other dark and plump, with merry eyes bright with promise. Wine held the whole camp in its grip, a potent wall against the terrors of the last days, and in its turn invoked a higher defense and refuge. The corsairs knew few restraints. The women had all but lost theirs in the shock of battle and abduction. Soon bodies lay sprawled across the warm sand, writhing in a different dance, blind to all except inner need. Elof staggered and reeled between the girls, giggling and breathless with excitement. They stumbled away up the beach to a shallow little cave between the cliff roots, and sank down gratefully on the dry sand of its floor. Their clothes, torn and befouled by death in many forms, fell away, leaving only living flesh and blood yet flowing, and no barrier between them. Darkness and oblivion rushed in his veins, roared in his head, till all he knew of was the warm flesh enfolding him, the soft, damp skin that trembled and fluttered against his body, the breasts pressed flat against him, or hanging like fair fruit to his hungry lips. He turned from one to another, taking and giving an animal comfort that blotted out all else. And yet his breath grew fast and shallow, as the fire roared, blazed to its height, and the hammer strokes struck searing sparks to weld the linked bodies rigid. It was Kara he saw. Kara he held. Kara was a vision in flames within, that consumed him in an instant to darkly glowing embers, and in the last, to sleep. He woke before dawn, slipped out from between the girls, covering them with their clothes, and staggered down to the beach to bathe. The shock of the cold water revived him, and he came out feeling cleansed inside and out, but mortally chill and hungry. He dressed in such of his clothes as he could still bear to wear, found others among the booty, and wine, bread, and meat among the remains of the orgy. As he strode back along the beach, he came upon Kermorven, sitting with his back to a rock and throwing pebbles out into the grey water, and greeted him merry. "I didn't see you enjoying yourself last night." Kermorven gazed up at Elof with bleak eyes. "Enjoying myself? In that?" The weight of bitterness in his voice startled the smith. "What ails the great warrior, then? Do you not like girls?" "Of course," said Kermorven indignantly, "but not like that." "Well, how then?" demanded Elof, more than a little nettled. "At your sword's point?" In a flash, Kermorven was on his feet, his pale eyes glaring down into Elof's, and his fist bunched in the smith's jerkin. "I was not raised to suffer any taunt lightly. Be glad it is untrue, or I might find pleasure in proving it on your hide." "Well, you scorn me freely enough. Were you raised to do that? Where's the harm in all that went on, rough-grained though it be? I saw nobody taken against their will." Kermorven subsided, muttering, "It profanes something sacred, something vital between a man and a woman that ought to be theirs alone. Respect, regard, cherishing. Out on the sand like lust-ridden animals. But I am sorry I insulted you, Smith. It is simply that you do not understand." "What makes you so sure of that?" inquired Elof dryly. "I may be village-bred, but I love. I still cherish her all my life, if I can only find her again. But she and I, we both inhabit bodies. They will have their needs, and those needs may be overwhelming, warrior, especially in the face of what we lived through yesterday." He looked at the lines on the tall man's face, the shadows under his eyes. "You slept poorly last night, I would guess, if at all. But I slept, though I have seen less slaughter than you in the world." "I," sighed the other, "I have seen too much, and I fear you and I may live to see more. Forget my harsh words, if you can, for you may well be wiser than I. But tell me, you who were village-bred, you who were taken by this great shaman, what have you seen in your time? What is this thing you made, this blade. Tell me, if you will, for I fear it concerns all who oppose the Ekwesh, and perhaps also the ice." Elof studied the face before him, eager yet anxious, with the bright, direct eyes of an eagle. How much would he understand of what must be told? This man of justice. Would he understand mercy? But he was right. Inescapably right. Told it must be, and at whatever cost. "Mylio," was the swordsman's first reaction. "That name is of my people. There's nothing else good of it. It was borne by nobles of the Old North, some of whom yet live on in Bryhane. But the last was exiled in my father's day, I think. A scholar, but a wicked, ambitious man who maltreated his peasants beyond bearing. Is this his son? Maybe. Or the man himself. There were treatises on the extending of life in his library, all on the forbidden wall." Kermorvan's brow darkened with sudden distrust. "Dark arts. I've never believed in them, not truly, but you have studied them." "I have," said Elof steadily. "Hear me out." Kermorvan nodded, acknowledging that that was just. He hung on every word, choking back the 100 questions that hovered on his lips, until Elof told of the night shapes, of the bell and the strange warrior party whose coming it had heralded. "Karis," breathed the warrior. "Duergar, it could only be. The cut trees also, and the mine workings. That explains much, very much." "Duergar?" asked Elof, puzzled. "Hear him," breathed Kermorvan, almost laughing. "He walks among marvels and does not know them. You have never heard of the elders, the mountain folk? Why, But go on, finish your story." Elof shrugged, and told of the sword's power unleashed, his warning, and his strange escape. "So you see, we have been carried, somehow, further and faster than a horse could have borne us, to an easy path down." Kermorvan nodded. "You were taken by secret ways through the mountains, not over them. Naturally that was faster. But go on." His face was sympathetic as Elof told of their troubled wanderings, his loss, and his decision to seek healing in the marshlands. Kermorvan stared with greater wonder at the sword when told of its origins, but kept silent. It was only when Elof told of the strange rider that he sat up sharply, as if arrow-struck. "Raven! You've seen Raven!" "I've seen many ravens. There were 2 that night. I mean the man, He swallowed and looked wildly around him. "Your visitor, you—" He shook his head violently. "You don't believe me, I see," said Elof sharply. "Well, I cannot prove it. But who is this Raven character, anyhow? I could use a word or 2 with him." Kermorvan was making undignified stuttering sounds. "Oh, I believe you," he managed to say at last. "You would not say anything so ridiculous if it were not the truth. But suppose I said I saw the maiden Scythana swimming up to join us here? Eh? Because it's about as likely." "What do you mean?" cried Elof. "I mean, you smith of strange marvels." But then he shook his head and looked around uneasily. "I cannot say. I have to think. Later, not now." "Not now?" groaned Elof. "But I have to know what to do, now. You see what I have unleashed?" Kermorven visibly gathered his wits and considered. Yes, and I can find some counsel in what you have told me. It can be made, as I said, can be unmade, or it can be countered. Make some other weapon, since this peculiar power of yours is with you once more, and go up against it. But how? Breathed Elof. I lack the knowledge. Which your former master has. A problem, yes. But do you not see that he also lacks something? The power, the art, or whatever you call it, or he would have made such a terrible thing himself, and never have entrusted it to an apprentice. Perhaps he did not expect it to come so powerful from your hands. But I wonder, that absence of his was so convenient. He may have been tempting you to see what you might produce. He may have even planted the seed of that betrayal of your fellow apprentice in your mind, which would lift some of it from you. But whatever the reason, you have one great comfort, evidently. In this strange art of yours, you are more potent than he. Elof sat gaping like an idiot, as the clear, cold voice hammered home its truths. Waves washed through him as they fell against the beach, and he felt something burgeon within him, rising from toe-tip to the roots of his hair, so that it bristled and rose. His hand sank to the goad at his belt, closed round characters he had remembered. Yes, he breathed. It must be so. He knew. So, then your problem is simple. Find yourself a better master, and learn what you need from him. But who? Most mastersmiths would have no truck with a vagrant like me, except old Joran, and he knows nothing of the kind of things I would need. No masters among men, maybe, but there are others. Others? Aye, and you have met them already, and that alone is like a meeting out of dreams to me, or a childhood fable. Again, your master has kept you ignorant of what might serve you in the world, for it has long been said that in the high mountains bordering both Northland and Southland dwell the elder folk, the stunted ones that in your northern tongue are named the Duergar. In my tongue? Asked Elof. But before you used it, I never heard the name, not even as a childhood tale, though I was not told many tales. No, not even then. Yet it is known even in our poor cloistered Southlands, where no legends ride abroad to smithy doors. In the wild lands of our inland marches, under the shadow of the mountains and the great forest, only a few dwell, hillmen and hunters, simple at best, more often cloven in mind. Some claim to have occasional meetings on the high slopes with the elders of the mountains, and they revere them more than their own civilized lords. He shook his head. It is said they are the greatest masters of smithcraft, and once taught our ancestors. It is said also that seeking them out is deadly peril. He sighed. But our need is great, and you who are so powerful a smith might find welcome among them, for they are clearly no friends of the man you seek to counter, and once you saved them from him. Most important of all, you know what no others seem to, a region where they may actually dwell. I do, mused Elof. Though the aid I gave them is paid, surely, and it would be a long and dangerous journey alone. So it would be, But you need not go alone. I will come with you, If, after all I have said, you can tolerate me. Tolerate you? Elof looked askance at the tall, young man beside him, selecting another pebble to throw with deep care and concentration. He thought of a flying leap between ships in poor light, in armor that would drag a man down living into Amicac's jaws if he so much as slipped, all to save lives among his crew. But you have a purpose here, among the Corsairs. My purpose is fighting the Akwesh. They tore me from my home, and what shreds of prosperity and influence I yet enjoyed. I had hoped to lead this ship in time, to buy and recruit others, and weld them into a real shielding force. But last night I saw finally that for all that butcher's work, all the lives lost, I had hardly scratched the surface of their armor. One ship, a 30th part of a 10th part of their present fleet, and that barely a 10th of what their force might be, if they are united under one banner. That, above all, I must fight. And I do firmly believe that you have been sent to me to do that. You, Smith, you are my chance, and I must not fail it, or you. I ask again, will you go with me? How old are you, Kermorvan? 25 years. You look older. I am only 20, 21 at most, and hardly fit, it seems, to be running loose in this world. If you will tolerate me, why then, I'll go with you gladly.